welcome to Expert Talks. I'm Agathe Ducar. Today I'm with Jean-Grégoire Manoukian, known as JG. He will be giving us some insight on what ESG really means, how it is related to COVID-19 crisis, and what aspect you could be missing. Finally, we'll look at trends to anticipate the future of ESG. JG, you have been active in EHS space for the past 15 years. And ESG is like the trendiest buzzword these days. But it's not entirely new. In fact, lots of companies started reporting on these metrics years ago. JG, can you give us some background behind the rise of ESG?
Yes, ESG is much more than sustainability. In fact, it's been building up for decades, and there are two words that give some background behind the rise of ESG. Intangible assets. Now, what is that? Well, tangible assets are things like buildings and land that a company owns, the machines in those buildings, inventory, and cash on hand. These are all things to which you can easily assign a value, which gives you an idea of how much a company is worth. Intangible assets, on the other hand, are things like patents, customer data, intellectual property, and more importantly, brand value.
I see. And is one more important than the other?
Well, according to Ocean Tomo, a US financial firm, in 1975, 83% of the total market value of the S&P 500 was composed of tangible assets. 17% was made up of intangible assets. But in 2020, tangible assets made up only 10% of the total value of the S&P 500. Intangible assets made up 90% of the value. It went from 17 to 90%. So we have seen a steady increase in the value of intangible assets, of which brand reputation is a part of. And because intangible assets and brand reputation are big parts of a company's value, investment firms naturally want to know more about them, and that's where ESG metrics play a role. They help investors evaluate potential risks to corporate reputation.
That's very well explained. I can clearly see the correlation between the two. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it also seems like the talk around ESG and climate change has increased because of COVID-19 pandemic. What is the relationship between COVID, climate change, and ESG?
Yes, risk management is the common denominator to COVID-19, climate change, and ESG. The pandemic was an accelerator because it shined a bright spotlight on two problems. First, the big operational disruptions brought by COVID-19 showed that companies are not assessing the impacts of risks that well. COVID-19 was not a unique event. We had SARS and the swine flu years ago, so infectious diseases are not new. The second thing that COVID exposed is that companies are much more vulnerable than we think. Remember all those cases in various companies where production was completely stopped because of an outbreak at a factory or at a supplier halfway around the world? So investors looked at the COVID crisis, and then they looked at this other crisis called climate change, and they asked themselves this question: are companies prepared for climate change impacts? Or are they going to be blindsided like they were for COVID?
And that's definitely a fair question.
Yeah, it is, because climate change is a perfect storm of 5 different types of risk. One, you have physical risks and the impact of severe weather on facilities, supply chains, electrical grids. That's been in the news lately. Two, you have reputational risks because consumers want to know what you're doing about climate change. Three, there are compliance risks due to applicable regulations. Four, you have legal risks from climate-related lawsuits against companies. And finally, for the oil and gas industry, you have financial risks because of potentially stranded assets. ESG metrics help investors and stakeholders evaluate the business and reputational risks of climate change to your company. They want to know if you're resilient and if you're ready to face a crisis.
Yes, I can see why it's critical. Well, now that we understand what's at stake, can you tell us what future ESG trends we should keep an eye on? And what do you find interesting?
There's one trend that I find especially interesting. It affects financial firms and ESG ratings agencies, but it's also relevant to companies producing ESG reports. It's the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms to make sense of ESG disclosures. And it's already happening today. For example, a company like RepRisk, based in Switzerland, combines AI and machine learning with human analysis to identify ESG risks on more than 175,000 companies. Also, a report published by GreenBiz covered this topic. The report said that the use of AI is in response to confusion around ESG reportings. There are hundreds of ESG ratings agencies in the world, and corporate ESG disclosures are not consistent and standard. And GreenBiz explained what this may mean for companies. For example, ESG reports may have to include keywords that algorithms would view favorably. Also, trying to impress stakeholders by disclosing a ton of ESG metrics may not work because AI and algorithm can simply go through all the data and identify what's important. So data consistency and quality will matter much more. Ultimately, if your company discloses ESG metrics or if you produce sustainability reports, it's not just humans who will consume your data. Machines and algorithms will also look at your metrics and interpret them for humans. So your ESG reporting practices will have to take that into account.
That is definitely something to keep an eye on for sure. JG, thank you so much for explaining what ESG really means and what's behind it. And thank you all for watching Expert Talks. Stay tuned for more insights on industry topics like ESG ratings and how to gather consistent metrics.